Mr. Deuceace, Diamond Cut Diamond, by William Thackeray. The name of my next master was, if possible, still more elegant and euphonious than that of my first. I now found myself body servant to the Honorable Algernon Percy Deuceace, youngest and fifth son of the Earl of Crabs. Algernon was a barrister. That is, he lived in Pump Court, Temple, a vulgar neighborhood which perhaps my readers don't know. Suffice to say, it's on the confines of the city, and the chosen abode of the lawyers of this metropolis. When I say that Mr. Deuceace was a barrister, I don't mean that he went sessions, or surcoats as they call them, but simply that he kept chambers, lived in Pump Court, and looked out for a commissionership, or a revisionship, or any other place that the Whig government could give him. His father was a Whig peer, as the laundress told me, and had been a Tory peer. The fact is, his lordship was so poor that he would be anything or nothing to get provisions for his sons, and an income for himself. I fancy that he allowed Algernon $200 a year, and it would have been a very comfortable maintenance, only he never paid him. However, the young gentleman was a gentleman, and no mistake. He got his allowance of nothing a year, and spent it in the most honorable and fashionable manner. He kept a cab, he went to Holmack's and Crockford's, he moved in the most exquisite circles, and troubled the law books very little, I can tell you. Those fashionable gents have ways of getting money which common people don't understand. Though he only had a third floor in Pump Court, he lived as if he had the wealth of Croesus. The 10-pound notes flew about as common as halfpence. Claret and champagne was at his house as vulgar as gin, and very glad I was, to be sure, to be a valet to a scion of the nobility. Deuceace had in his sitting-room a large picture on a sheet of paper. The names of his family was wrote on it. It was wrote in the shape of a tree, a-growing out of a man-in-armor's stomach, and the names were on little plates among the boughs. The picture said that the Deuceaces came into England in the year 1066, along with William Conquerwins. My master called it his pedigree. I do believe it was because he had this picture, and because he was the Honorable Deuceace, that he managed to live as he did. If he had been a common man, you'd have said that he was no better than a swindler. It's only rank and birth that can warrant such singularities as my master showed. For it's no use disguising it. The Honorable Algernon was a gambler. For a man of vulgar family, it's the worst trade that can be. For a man of common feelings of honesty, this profession is quite impossible. But for a real thoroughbred gentleman, it's the easiest and most profitable line he can take. It may perhaps appear curious that such a fashionable man should live in the Temple, but it must be recollected that it's not only lawyers who live in what's called the Inns of Court. Many bachelors who have nothing to do with law have here their lodgings, and many sham barristers who never put on a wig and gown twice in their lives keep apartments in the Temple instead of Bond Street, Piccadilly, or other fashionable places. For instance, on our staircase, so these houses are called, there was 8 sets of chamberses, and only 3 lawyers. These was bottom floor, Screwson, Hewson, and Jewson, attorneys. First floor, Mr. Sergeant Flabber. Opposite, Mr. Councillor Bruffy. And second pair, Mr. Haggerstony, an Irish councillor practicing at the Old Bailey, and likewise what they call reporter to the Morning Post newspaper. Opposite him was wrote, Mr. Richard Blewett. And on the third floor, with my master, lived one Mr. Dawkins. This young fellow was a newcomer into the Temple, and unlucky it was for him too. He'd better have never been born, for it's my firm opinion that the Temple ruined him, that is, with the help of my master and Mr. Dick Blewett, as you shall hear. Mr. Dawkins, as I was gave to understand by his young man, had just left the University of Oxford, and had a pretty little form of his own, £6,000 or so, in the stocks. He was just of age, an orphan who had lost his father and mother, and having distinguished himself at college, where he gained several prizes, was come to town to push his form and study the barrister's business. Not being of a very high family himself, indeed I've heard say his father was a cheesemonger or something of that low sort, Dawkins was glad to find his old Oxford friend, Mr. Blewitt, younger son to rich Squire Blewitt, of Leicestershire, and to take rooms so near him. Now, though there was a considerable intimacy between me and Mr. Blewitt's gentleman, there was scarcely any betwixt our masters, mine being too much of the aristocracy to associate with one of Mr. Blewitt's sort. Blewitt was what they call a bettin' man. He went regular to Tattersall's, kept a pony, wore a white hat, a Bluebeard's eye handkerchief, and a cutaway coat. In his manners he was the very contrary of my master, who was a slim, elegant man as ever I see. He had very white hands, rather a sallow face, with sharp dark eyes, and small whiskers neatly trimmed, and as black as Warren's jet. He spoke very low and soft. He seemed to be watching the person with whom he was in conversation, and always flattered everybody. As for Blewitt, he was quite another sort. He was always swearing, singing, and slapping people on the back, as hearty and as familiar as possible. He seemed a merry, careless, honest creature, whom one would trust with life and soul. So thought Dawkins, at least, who, though a quiet young man, fond of his books, novels, Byron's poems, flute-playing, and such scientific amusements, grew hand in glove with honest Dick Blewitt, and soon after with my master, the Honourable Algernon. Poor Daw! He thought he was making good connections and real friends. He had fallen in with a couple of the most atrocious swindlers that ever lived. Before Mr. Dawkins's arrival in our house, Mr. Deuceace had barely condescended to speak to Mr. Blewitt. It was only about a month after that circumstance that my master, all of a sudden, grew very friendly with him. The reason was pretty clear. Deuceace wanted him. Dawkins had not been an hour in master's company before he knew that he had a pigeon to pluck. Blewitt knew this too, and being very fond of pigeon, intended to keep this one entirely to himself. It was amusing to see the Honourable Algernon manoeuvring to get this poor bird out of Blewitt's claws, who thought he had it safe. In fact, he'd brought Dawkins to these chambers for that very purpose, thinking to have him under his eye, and strip him at leisure. My master very soon found out what was Mr. Blewitt's game. Gamblers know gamblers, if not by instinct, at least by reputation. And though Mr. Blewitt moved in a much lower sphere than Mr. Deuceace, they knew each other's dealings and characters perfectly well. "Charles, you scoundrel," says Deuceace to me one day. He always spoke in that kind of way. "Who is this person who has taken the opposite chambers, and plays the flute so industriously?" "It's Mr. Dawkins, a rich young gentleman from Oxford, and a great friend of Mr. Blewitt's, sir," says I. "They seem to live in each other's rooms." Master said nothing, but he grinned. My, he did grin. Not the foul fiend himself could sneer more satanically. I knew what he meant. Imprimish. A man who plays the flute is a simpleton. Secondly, Mr. Blewitt is a rascal. Third mo, when a rascal and a simpleton is always together, and when the simpleton is rich, one knows pretty well what will come of it. I was but a lad in them days, but I knew what was what as well as my master. It's not gentlemen only that's up to snuff. Law bless us, there was 4 of us on this staircase, 4 as nice young men as you ever see. Mr. Bruffy's young man, Mr. Dawkins's, Mr. Blewitt's, and me. And we knew what our masters was about as well as they did theirselves. For instance, I can say this for myself. There wasn't a paper in Deuceace's desk or drawer, not a bill, a note, or memorandum, which I hadn't read as well as he. With Blewitt's it was the same. Me and his young man used to read 'em all. There wasn't a bottle of wine that we didn't get a glass, nor a pound of sugar that we didn't have some lumps of it. We had keys to all the cupboards. We peeped into all the letters that came and went. We pored over all the bill files. We'd the best pickings out of the dinners, the livers of the fowls, the forcemeat balls out of the soup, the eggs from the salad. As for the coals and candles, we left them to the laundresses. You may call this robbery. Nonsense. It's only our right. A servant's perquisites is as sacred as the laws of England. Well, the long and short of it is this. Richard Blewitt, Esquire, was situated as follows. He'd an income of $300 a year from his father. Out of this he had to pay $190 for money borrowed by him at college, $70 for chambers, $70 more for his horse, $80 for his servant on board wages, and about $350 for a separate establishment in the Regency Park. Besides this, his pocket money, say $100, his eatin', drinkin', and wine merchant's bill, about $200 more. So that you see, he laid by a pretty handsome sum at the end of the year. My master was different, and being a more fashionable man than Mr. B., in course he owed a deal more money. There was first account contrary at Crockford's, £3,711, bills of exchange and IOUs, but he didn't pay these in most cases, £4,963, 21 tailor's bills, in all £1,306, 11 shillings and 9 pence. 3 hoss dealers due, £402, 2 coach builder, £506, bills contracted at Cambridge, £2,193, 6 shillings and 8 pence. Sundries, £987, 6 shillings. Total, £14,069, 8 shillings and 5 pence. I give this as a curiosity. People don't know how, in many cases, fashionable life is carried on, and to know even what a real gentleman owes is something instructive and agreeable. But to my tale. The very day after my master had made the inquiries concerning Mr. Dawkins, which I have mentioned already, he met Mr. Blewitt on the stairs, and beautiful it was to see how this gentleman, who had before been almost cut by my master, was now received by him. One of the sweetest smiles I ever saw was now visible on Mr. Deuceace's countenance. He held out his hand, covered with a white kid glove, and said, in the most friendly tone of voice possible, "What, Mr. Blewitt! It's an age since we met. What a shame that such near neighbors should see each other so seldom." Mr. Blewitt, who was standing at his door in a pea-green dressing gown, smoking a cigar, and singing a hunting chorus, looked surprised, flattered, and then suspicious. "Why, yes," says he, "it is, Mr. Deuceace, a long time. Not, I think, since we dined at Sir George Hockey's. By the way, what an evening that was, hey, Mr. Blewitt? What wine, what capital songs! I recollect your May Day in the Morning, cuss me, the best comic song I ever heard. I was speaking to the Duke of Doncaster about it only yesterday. You know the Duke, I think?" Mr. Blewitt said quite surly, "No, I don't." "Not know him?" cries the master. "Why, hang it, Blewitt, he knows you, as every sporting man in England does, I should think. Why, man, your good things are in everybody's mouth at Newmarket." And so master went on chaffing Mr. Blewitt. That gentleman at first answered him quite short and angry, but after a little more flummery, he grew as pleased as possible, took in all Deuceace's flattery, and believed all his lies. At last the door shut, and they both went into Mr. Blewitt's chambers together. Of course I can't say what passed there, but in an hour master came up to his own room as yeller as mustard, and smelling sadly of tobacco smoke. I never seen any gentleman more than he was. He'd been smoking cigars along with Blewitt. I said nothing, in course, though I'd often heard him express his horror of tobacco, and knew very well he would as soon swallow poison as smoke. But he wasn't a chap to do a thing without a reason. If he'd been smoking, I warrant he had smoked to some purpose. I didn't hear the conversation between 'em, but Mr. Blewitt's man did. It was, "Well, Mr. Blewitt, what capital seegars! Have you one for a friend to smoke?" The old fox! It wasn't only the seegars he was smoking. "Walk in," says Mr. Blewitt. And then they began a chaffing together. Master very anxious about the young gentleman who had come to live in our chambers, Mr. Dawkins, and always coming back to that subject, saying that people on the same staircase ought to be friendly. How glad he'd be, for his part, to know Mr. Dick Blewitt, and any friend of his, and so on. Mr. Dick, howsoever, seemed quite aware of the trap laid for him. "I really don't know this Dawkins," says he. "He's a cheesemonger's son, I hear, and though I've exchanged visits with him, I don't intend to continue the acquaintance, not wishing to associate with that kind of people." So they went on, Master fishing, and Mr. Blewitt not wishing to take the hook at no price. "Confound the vulgar thief!" muttered my master, as he was laying on his sofy, after being so very ill. "I've poisoned myself with his infernal tobacco, and he has foiled me. The cursed swindling boor! He thinks he'll ruin this poor cheesemonger, does he? I'll step in and warn him." I thought I should bust a-laughing when he talked in this style. I knew very well what his warning meant. Locking the stable door, but stealing the hoss first. Next day his stratagem for becoming acquainted with Mr. Dawkins he executed, and very pretty it was. Besides poetry and the flute, Mr. Dawkins, I must tell you, had some other partialities. Namely, he was very fond of good eating and drinking. After dawdling over his music and books all day, this young gentleman used to sally out of evenings, dine sumptuously at a tavern, drinking all sorts of wine along with his friend Mr. Blewitt. He was a quiet young fellow enough at first, but it was Mr. B. who, for his own purposes no doubt, had got him into this kind of life. Well, I needn't say that he who eats a fine dinner and drinks too much overnight wants a bottle of soda water and a grill, perhaps, in the morning. Such was Mr. Dawkins's case, and regular almost as 12 o'clock came, the waiter from Mr. Dick's coffee house was to be seen on our staircase, bringing up Mr. D.'s hot breakfast. No man would have thought there was anything in such a trifling circumstance. Master did, though, and pounced upon it like a cock on a barleycorn. He sent me out to Mr. Morell's, in Piccadilly, for what's called a Strasburg pie, in French, a patty de foie gras. He takes a card and nails it on the outside case. Patty de foie gras come generally in a round wooden box, like a drum. And what do you think he writes on it? Why, as follows, quote, "For the Honorable Algernon Percy Deuceace, etc., 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 with Prince Talleyrand's compliments," end quote. Prince Talleyrand's compliments, indeed! I laugh when I think of it still, the old serpent. He was a serpent, that Deuceace, and no mistake. Well, by a most extraordinary piece of ill luck, the next day, punctually as Mr. Dawkins's breakfast was coming up the stairs, Mr. Algernon Percy Deuceace was going down. He was as gay as a lark, humming an opera tune, and twisting round his head his heavy gold-headed cane. Down he went very fast, and by a most unlucky accident struck his cane against the waiter's tray, and away went Mr. Dawkins's grill, cayenne, ketchup, soda water, and all. I can't think how my master should have chose such an exact time. To be sure, his window looked upon the court, and he could see every one who came into our door. As soon as the accident had took place, master was in such a rage as to be sure no man ever was in before. He swore at the waiter in the most dreadful way. He threatened him with his stick, and it was only when he see that the waiter was rather a bigger man than himself that he was in the least pacified. He returned to his own chambers, and John, the waiter, went off for more grill to Dixie's coffee house. "This is a most unlucky accident, to be sure, Charles," says master to me, after a few minutes' pause, during which he had been and wrote a note, put it in an envelope, and sealed it with his big seal of arms. "But stay, a thought strikes me. Take this note to Mr. Dawkins, and that pie you brought yesterday. And hark ye, you scoundrel, if you say where you got it, I will break every bone in your skin." These kind of promises were among the few which I knew him to keep, and as I loved both my skin and my bones, I carried the note, and of course said nothing. Waiting in Mr. Dawkins's chambers for a few minutes, I returned to my master with an answer. I may as well give both of these documents, of which I happen to have taken copies. 1. The Honorable A.P. Deuceace to T.S. Dawkins, Esquire, Temple, Tuesday. Mr. Deuceace presents his compliments to Mr. Dawkins, and begs at the same time to offer his most sincere apologies and regrets for the accident which has just taken place. May Mr. Deuceace be allowed to take a neighbor's privilege, and to remedy the evil he has occasioned to the best of his power. If Mr. Dawkins will do him the favor to partake of the contents of the accompanying case, from Strasburg direct, and the gift of a friend, on whose taste as a gourmand Mr. Dawkins may rely, perhaps he will find that it is not a bad substitute for the pâté which Mr. Deuceace's awkwardness destroyed. It will also, Mr. Deuceace is sure, be no small gratification to the original donor of the plat, when he learns that it has fallen into the hands of so celebrated a bon vivant as Mr. Dawkins. T.S. Dawkins, Esquire, etc., etc., etc. 2. From T.S. Dawkins, Esquire, to the Honorable A.P. Deuceace. Mr. Thomas Smith Dawkins presents his grateful compliments to the Honorable Mr. Deuceace, and accepts with the greatest pleasure Mr. Deuceace's generous proffer. It would be one of the happiest moments of Mr. Smith Dawkins' life if the Honorable Mr. Deuceace would extend his generosity still further, and condescend to partake of the repast which his munificent politeness has furnished. Temple, Tuesday. Many and many a time, I say, have I grinned over these letters, which I had wrote from the original by Mr. Bruffy's copying clerk. Deuceace's flam about Prince Talleyrand was perfectly successful. I saw young Dawkins blush with delight as he read the note, and tore up 4 or 5 sheets before he composed the answer to it, which was as you read above, and wrote in a hand quite trembling with pleasure. If you could have but seen the look of triumph in Deuceace's wicked black eyes when he read the note. I never see a demon yet, but I can fancy one a-holding a writhing soul on his pitchfork, and smiling like Deuceace. He dressed himself in his very best clothes, and in he went, after sending me over to say that he would accept with pleasure Mr. Dawkins' invite. The pie was cut up, and a most friendly conversation begun betwixt the two gentlemen. Deuceace was quite captivating. He spoke to Mr. Dawkins in the most respectful and flattering manner, agreed in everything he said, praised his taste, his furniture, his coat, his classic knowledge, and his playing on the flute. You'd have thought to hear him that such a polygon of excellence as Mr. Dawkins did not breathe, that such a modest, sincere, honorable gentleman as Deuceace was to be seen nowhere except in Pump Court. Poor Daw was completely taken in. My master said he'd introduce him to the Duke of Doncaster, and heaven knows how many knobs more, till Dawkins was quite intoxicated with pleasure. I know as a fact, and it pretty well shows the young gentleman's character, that he went that very day and ordered 2 new coats, on purpose to be introduced to the lords in. But the best joke of all was at last. Singing, swaggering, and swearing, up the stairs came Mr. Dick Blewitt. He flung open Mr. Dawkins' door, shouting out, "Daw, my old buck, how are you?" when all of a sudden he sees Mr. Deuceace. His jaw dropped, he turned chalky white, and then burning red, and looked as if a straw would knock him down. "My dear Mr. Blewitt," says my master, smiling and offering his hand, "how glad I am to see you. Mr. Dawkins and I were just talking about your pony. Pray sit down." Blewitt did, and now was the question who should sit the other out. But law bless you, Mr. Blewitt was no match for my master. All the time he was fidgety, silent, and sulky. On the contrary, master was charming. I never heard such a flow of conversation, or so many witticisms as he uttered. At last, completely beat, Mr. Blewitt took his leave. That instant master followed him, and passing his arm through that of Mr. Dick, led him into our chambers, and began talking to him in the most affable and affectionate manner. But Dick was too angry to listen. At last, when master was telling him some long story about the Duke of Doncaster, Blewitt bust out, "A plague on the Duke of Doncaster! Come, Mr. Deuceace, don't you be running your rigs upon me. I ain't the man to be bamboozled by long-winded stories about dukes and duchesses. You think I don't know you? Every man knows you and your line of country. Yes, you're after young Dawkins there, and think to pluck him, but you shan't. No, by blank, you shan't." The reader must recollect that the oaths which interspersed Mr. B.'s conversation I have left out. Well, after he'd fired a volley of them, Mr. Deuceace spoke, as cool and slow as possible. "Hark ye, Blewitt, I know you to be one of the most infernal thieves and scoundrels unhung. If you attempt to hector with me, I will cane you. If you want more, I'll shoot you. If you meddle between me and Dawkins, I'll do both. I know your whole life, you miserable swindler and coward. I know you have already won 200 pounds of this lad, and want all. I will have half, or you never shall have a penny." It's quite true that master knew things, but how was the wonder? I couldn't see Mr. B.'s face during this dialogue, being on the wrong side of the door, but there was a considerable pause after those compliments had passed between the two gentlemen, one walking up and down the room, t'other, angry and stupid, sitting down and stamping with his foot. "Now listen to this, Mr. Blewitt," continues master at last. "If you're quiet, you shall have half this fellow's money, but venture to win a shilling from him in my absence, or without my consent, and you do it at your peril." "Well, well, Mr. Deuceace," cries Dick, "it's very hard, and I must say not fair. The game was of my starting, and you've no right to interfere with my friend." "Mr. Blewitt, you are a fool. You professed yesterday not to know this man, and I was obliged to find him out for myself. I should like to know by what law of honor I'm bound to give him up to you." It was charming to hear this pair of rascals talking about honor. I declare I could have found it in my heart to warn young Dawkins of the precious way in which these chaps were going to serve him. But if they didn't know what honor was, I did, and never, never did I tell tales about my masters when in their service. Out in course, the obligation is no longer binding. Well, the next day there was a grand dinner at our chambers. White soup, turbot, and lobster sauce, saddle of Scotch mutton, grouse, and maroni, wine, champagne, hock, Madeira, a bottle of port, and ever so many of claret. The company present was three, namely, the Honourable A.P. Deuceace, R. Blewitt, and Mr. Dawkins, Esquires. My eye, how we gentlemen in the kitchen did enjoy it! Mr. Blewitt's man ate so much grouse, when it was brought out of the parlour, that I really thought he would be sick. Mr. Dawkins's gentleman, who was only about 13 years of age, grew so ill with maroni and plum pudding, so to be obliged to take several of Mr. D.'s pills, which one half killed him. But this is all promiscuous. I ain't talking of the servants now, but the masters. Would you believe it? After dinner, and perhaps 8 bottles of wine between the three, the gentlemen sat down to arty. It's a game where only 2 plays, and where, in course, when there's only 3, 1 looks on. First they played crown points, and a pound the bet. At this game they were wonderful equal, and about supper time, when grilled ham, more champagne, deviled biscuits, and other things was brought in, the play stood thus. Mr. Dawkins had won 2 pounds, Mr. Blewitt 30 shillings, the Honourable Mr. Deuceace having lost 3 pounds 10 shillings. After the dula and the champagne, the play was a little higher. Now it was pound points, and £5 the bet. I thought, to be sure, after hearing the compliments between Mr. Blewitt and master in the morning, that now poor Dawkins' time was come. Not so. Dawkins won always, Mr. B. betting on his play, and giving him the very best of advice. At the end of the evening, which was about 5 o'clock the next morning, they stopped. Master was counting up the score on a card. "Blewitt," says he, "I've been unlucky. I owe you, let me see, yes, £45. "£5.40, says Blewitt, and no mistake. "I will give you a check," says the honourable gentleman. "Oh, don't mention it, my dear sir." But master got a great sheet of paper, and drew him a check on Messrs. Pump, Algett and Company, his bankers. "Now," says master, "I've got to settle with you, my dear Mr. Dawkins. If you had backed your luck, I should have owed you a very handsome sum of money. Voyons, 13 points at £1. It is easy to calculate." And drawing out his purse, he clinked over the table 13 golden sovereigns, which shone till they made my eyes wink. So did poor Dawkins's, as he put out his hand, all trembling, and drew them in. "Let me say," added master, "let me say, and I've had some little experience, that you are the very best écarté player with whom I ever sat down." Dawkins's eyes glistened as he put the money up, and said, "Law, deuce ace, you flatter me." Flatter him! I should think he did. It was the very thing which master meant. "But mind you, Dawkins," continued he, "I must have my revenge, for I'm ruined, positively ruined by your luck." "Well, well," says Mr. Thomas Smith Dawkins, as pleased as if he had gained $1 million. "Shall it be tomorrow? Blewitt, what say you?" Mr. Blewitt agreed in course. My master, after a little demurring, consented too. "We'll meet," says he, "at your chambers. But mind, my dear fellow, not too much wine. I can't stand it at any time, especially when I have to play écarté with you." Poor Dawkins left our rooms as happy as a prince. "Here, Charles," says he, and flung me a sovereign. Poor fellow! Poor fellow! I know what was a-coming. But the best of it was, that these 13 sovereigns which Dawkins won, master had borrowed them from Mr. Blewitt. I brought 'em with 7 more from that young gentleman's chambers that very morning, for since his interview with master, Blewitt had nothing to refuse him. Well, shall I continue the tale? If Mr. Dawkins had been the least bit wiser, it would have taken him 6 months before he lost his money. As it was, he was such a confounded ninny that it took him a very short time to part with it. Next day, it was Thursday, and master's acquaintance with Mr. Dawkins had only commenced on Tuesday. Mr. Dawkins, as I said, gave his party. Dinner at 7. Mr. Blewitt and the 2 Mr. D.'s as before. Play begins at 11. This time I knew the business was pretty serious, for we servants was packed off to bed at 2 o'clock. On Friday I went to chambers. No master. He came in for 5 minutes at about 12, made a little toilet, ordered more doulas and soda water, and back again he went to Mr. Dawkins's. They had dinner there at 7 again, but nobody seemed to eat, for all the victuals came out to us gentlemen. They had in more wine, though, and must have drunk at least 2 dozen in the 36 hours. At 10 o'clock, however, on Friday night, back my master came to his chambers. I saw him as I never saw him before, namely, reg'lar drunk. He staggered about the room, he danced, he hiccuped, he swore, he flung me a heap of silver, and finally he sunk down exhausted on his bed, I pulling off his boots and clothes and making him comfortable. When I had removed his garments, I did what it's the duty of every servant to do. I emptied his pockets, and looked at his pocketbook and all his letters. A number of accidents have been prevented that way. I found there, among a heap of things, the following pretty document. I owe you £4,700, Thomas Smith Dawkins, Friday, 16th January. There was another bit of paper of the same kind. I owe you £400, Richard Blewitt. But this, in course, meant nothing. Next morning at 9, master was up, and as sober as a judge. He dressed and was off to Mr. Dawkins. At 10 he ordered a cab, and the two gentlemen went together. "Where shall he drive, sir?" says I. "Oh, tell him to drive to the bank." Poor Dawkins, his eyes red with remorse and sleepless drunkenness, gave a shudder and a sob as he sunk back in the vehicle, and they drove on. That day he sold out every halfpenny he was worth, except £500. About 12 master had returned, and Mr. Dick Blewitt came striding up the stairs with a solemn and important air. "Is your master at home?" says he. "Yes, sir," says I, and in he walks. I, in course, with my ear to the keyhole, listening with all my might. "Well," says Blewitt, "we made a pretty good night of it, Mr. Deuceace. You settled, I see, with Dawkins." "Settled," says master. "Oh, yes, I've settled with him. 4,700, I think. About that, yes. That makes my share, let me see, 2,350, which I'll thank you to fork out." "Upon my word, why, Mr. Blewitt," says my master, "I don't really understand what you mean." "You don't know what I mean," says Blewitt, in an accent such as I never before heard. "You don't know what I mean! Did you not promise me that we were to go shares? Didn't I lend you 20 sovereigns the other night to pay our losings to Dawkins? Didn't you swear, on your honour as a gentleman, to give me half of all that might be won in this affair?" "Agreed, sir," says Deuceace, "agreed." "Well, sir, and now what have you to say?" "Why, that I don't intend to keep my promise. You infernal fool and ninny! Do you suppose I was labouring for you? Do you fancy I was going to the expense of giving a dinner to that jackass yonder, that you should profit by it? Get away, sir! Leave the room, sir! Or stop here. I will give you the £400, your own note of hand, sir, for that sum, if you will consent to forget all that has passed between us, and that you have never known Mr. Algernon Deuceace. I've seen people angry before now, but never any like Blewitt. He stormed, groaned, bellowed, swore. At last he fairly began blubbering, now cussing and gnashing his teeth, now praying dear Mr. Deuceace to grant him mercy. At last master flung open the door. Heaven bless us, it's well I didn't tumble head over heels